Okay. So tonight I'm going to read. I've been enjoying doing these. I don't know if anyone's watching. It doesn't particularly matter. But I'm reading this essay called Grandeur, Profundity, and Finitude by Rorty. It's from an essay collection of his called Philosophy as Cultural Politics. So here we go. Philosophy occupies an important place in culture only when things seem to be falling apart, when long-held and widely cherished beliefs are threatened. At such periods, intellectuals reinterpret the past in terms of an imagined future. They offer suggestions about what can be preserved and what must be discarded. The ones whose suggestions have been most influential win a place on the list of great philosophers. For example, when prayer and priestcraft began to be viewed with suspicion, Plato and Aristotle found ways for us to hold on to the idea that human beings, unlike beasts that perish, have a special relation to the ruling powers of the universe. When Copernicus and Galileo erased the world picture that had comforted Aquinas and Dante, Spinoza and Kant taught how to replace the love of God with the love of truth, and how to replace obedience to the divine will with moral purity. When the democratic revolutions and industrialization forced us to rethink the nature of the social bond, Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill stepped forward with some useful suggestions. In the course of the 20th century, there were no crises that called forth new philosophical ideas. There was no intellectual struggle comparable in scale to the one that Andrew White famously described as the warfare between science and theology. Nor were there any social convulsions that rendered either Mill's or Marx's suggestions irrelevant. As high culture became more thoroughly secularized, the educational classes of Europe and the Americas became complacently materialist in their understanding of how things work. In the battle between Plato and Democritus, the one Plato described as waged between the gods and the giants, Western intellectuals have come down once and for all on the side of the giants. They also became complacently utilitarian and experimentalist in their evaluations of proposed social and political initiatives. They share the same utopian vision, a global commonwealth in which human rights are respected, equality of opportunity is assured, and the chances of human happiness are thereby increased. Political argument nowadays is about how this goal might be reached. This consensus among the intellectuals has moved philosophy to the margins of culture. Such controversies as those between Russell and Bergson, Heidegger and Cassirer, Carnap and Quine, Ayer and Austin, Habermas and Gadamer, Fodor and Davidson have had little resonance outside the borders of philosophy departments. Philosophers' explanations of how the mind is related to the brain, or of how there can be a place for value in a world of fact, or of how free will and mechanism might be reconciled, do not intrigue most contemporary intellectuals. These problems, preserved in amber as the textbook Problems of Philosophy, still capture the imagination of some bright students. But no one would claim that discussion of them is central to intellectual life. Solving those very problems was all important for contemporaries of Spinoza, but when today's philosophy professors insist that they are perennial or that they remain fundamental, nobody listens. Most intellectuals of our day brush aside claims that our social practices require philosophical foundations with the same impatience as they display when similar claims are made for religion. But even though the struggle between the gods and the giants is over, two other controversies that Plato described are still alive. The first is the quarrel between philosophy and poetry, a quarrel that was revived by the Romantic movement and now takes the form of the tension between C.P. Snow's two cultures. This quarrel is about whether human beings are at their best, realize their special powers to the fullest, when they use reason to discover how things really are, or when they use imagination to transform themselves. The second is the quarrel that Plato described as between the philosophers and the sophists. This quarrel is between those who think there is an important virtue called the love of truth and those who do not. The standoff between Nietzsche and Plato that dominates a great deal of recent philosophical writing epitomizes both quarrels. That opposition, unlike any of the more parochial ones I listed earlier, is still capable of gripping the imagination of intellectuals who are commonsensical materialists and utilitarians. It would be an exaggeration to say that it is the center of contemporary life, but surely the best way for us philosophy professors to get the attention of people outside our own discipline is to raise the question of whether Plato was right, that human beings can transcend contingency by searching for truth, or whether Nietzsche was right, to treat both Platonism and religion as escapist fantasies. The quarrel that the philosophers have with the poets is not the same as their quarrel with the sophists, for reasons that I shall come to shortly. But the poets and the sophists have a lot in common, especially their doubts about the idea that natural science should serve as a model for the rest of high culture. Both are suspicious of what I shall call universalistic grandeur, the sort of grandeur attained by mathematics and by mathematical physics. Both numbers and elementary particles display the imperturbability traditionally attributed to the divine. The study of both produces structures of great beauty, structures that are godlike in their aloofness, their indifference to human concerns. The same impulse that led Plato to think that what he called the really real must be more like a number than a lump of dirt, has led many recent philosophers to take modern physical science as the overarching framework within which philosophical inquiry is to be conducted. Thus we find Quine identifying the question, is there a fact of the matter, with the question, does it make a difference to the elementary particles? A host of other philosophers have devoted themselves to naturalizing epistemology and naturalizing semantics. These are attempts to describe mind and language in terms which allow for the fact that what is thought and what is meant are supervenient on the behavior of physical particles. Whereas intellectuals in general are happy to agree that physical science tells you how things work, many contemporary philosophers are still Platonist enough to think that it does more than that. They think it tells you what is really real. Philosophers of this sort often describe the battle they wage against colleagues whom they describe as irrationalists, deniers of truth, or sophists as a defense of science against its enemies. Many of these philosophers think of natural science as pre-Galilean intellectuals thought of religion, as the area of culture in which human beings are at their best, because they are most willing in these areas to acknowledge the claims of something that transcends the human. Hostility to science is, in their view, a form of spiritual degradation. Thus, Bertrand Russell, at the beginning of the last century, reacted against the line of thought that William James called pragmatism, and his Oxford friend F.C.S. Schiller called humanism, by writing as follows, quote, "Greatness of soul is not fostered by those philosophies which assimilate the universe to man. Knowledge is a form of union of self and not self. Like all union, it is impaired by domination, and therefore by any attempt to force the universe into conformity with what we find in ourselves. There is a widespread philosophical tendency toward the view which tells us that man is the measure of all things, that truth is man-made. This view is untrue, but in addition to being untrue, it has the effect of robbing philosophical contemplation of all that gives it value. The free intellect will see as God might see, without a here and now, without hopes and fears, calmly, dispassionately, in the sole and exclusive desire of knowledge. Knowledge is impersonal, as purely contemplative as it is possible for man to attain." End quote. In our own day, Thomas Nagel shares Russell's contempt for those who believe that, as William James put it, the trail of the human serpent is over all. Nagel describes what he calls, quote, "the outermost framework of all thoughts" as, quote, "a conception of what is objectively the case, what is the case without subjective or relative qualification." In response to pragmatists and historicists who argue that all justification is by our lights, the lights of a particular time and place, Nagel replies that, quote, claims to the effect that a type of judgment expresses a local point of view are inherently objective in intent. They suggest a picture of the true sources of those judgments that places them in an unconditional context. The judgment of relativity or conditionality cannot be applied to the judgment of relativity itself. There may be some subjectivists, perhaps calling themselves pragmatists, who present subjectivism as applying even to itself. But then what they say does not call for a reply, since it is just a report of what the subjectivist finds it agreeable to say. End quote. Russell and Nagel share Plato's taste for universalist grandeur. They also share his conviction that there is no middle way between acknowledging the claims of the unconditional outermost framework of thought and simply saying whatever you find agreeable to say. Like Plato, they see human beings as facing a choice between striving for the universal and unconditional and giving free rein to unjustifiable idiosyncratic desires. So the pragmatist suggestion that mathematics and physics be thought of as simply useful for the improvement of man's estate, as tools for coping with our environment, strikes both Russell and Nagel as a symptom of moral slackness, as well as of intellectual error. I have attempted in previous writings to defend James's reply to Russell, and to restate the defense of Protagoras mounted by Schiller, by tying pragmatism together with romanticism. But it is important to emphasize the difference between a pragmatist and the kind of romantic who buys into the Platonic reason-passion distinction and then exalts passion at the expense of reason. The pragmatists have little use for either the reason-passion or the objective-subjective distinction. So, in this chapter, I shall contrast the two quarrels I have been discussing, the one between philosophy and poetry, and the one between Neoplatonists such as Russell and Nagel to neo-sophists like myself. To bring out the difference, I shall invoke two distinctions that Jürgen Habermas, R.I.P., you died yesterday, two distinctions that Jürgen Habermas drew in his book, The Philosophical Discourse of Modernity, distinctions that I have found invaluable in trying to tell a story about the history of modern philosophy. The first is the one Habermas makes between what he calls subject-centered reason and communicative reason. Subject-centered reason is a Platonic invention. It consists in a purported connaturality between the mind of each human being and the nature of things. Plato describes this connaturality in terms of the soul's pre-existence in an immaterial world. Descartes, Russell, and Nagel presuppose it when they claim that all we have to do to reach a transcendental and ahistorical outermost framework of thought is to substitute conceptual clarity for conceptual confusion. What Habermas calls communicative rationality, on the other hand, is not a natural human endowment, but a set of social practices. It is found in some measure wherever people are willing to hear the other side, to talk things over, to argue until areas of agreement are found, and to abide by the resulting agreements. To think of reason as subject-centered is to believe that human beings possess a faculty that enables them to circumvent conversation, to sidestep opinion, and head straight for knowledge. To replace subject-centered reason with communicative rationality is to see truth as what is likely to emerge from free and imaginative conversation. It is to think of knowledge as the achievement of consensus rather than as a mental state that enjoys a closer relation to reality than does opinion. To agree with Habermas that reason is communicative and dialogical rather than subject-centered and monological is to substitute responsibility to other human beings for responsibility to a non-human standard. It is to lower our sights from the unconditional above us to the community around us. This substitution enables us to accept with equanimity Kuhn's suggestion that scientists are better thought of as solving puzzles than as gradually disclosing the true nature of things. It helps us limit ourselves to hopes for small, finite, fleeting successes, and to give up the hope of participation in enduring grandeur. So much for Habermas's first distinction. His second is between remaining loyal to rationality and seeking what he calls, quote, an other to reason, end quote. Habermas uses the latter term to characterize such things as mystic insight, poetic inspiration, religious faith, imaginative power, and authentic self-expression, sources of conviction that have been put forward as superior to reason. Like Descartes' clear and distinct ideas, each of these others to reason is put forward as a shortcut around conversation, leading straight to truth. If you are in touch with such an other, you do not need to converse with other human beings. If you have something like what Kierkegaard called faith, or if you can engage in what Heidegger called denken, it will not matter to you whether or not other people can be persuaded to share your beliefs. It would debase the relevant other to reason to force those beliefs into the conversational arena, to make them compete in the marketplace of ideas. Habermas has suggested that I go too far when I deny that universal validity is the goal of inquiry. He thinks of my repudiation of this goal and my enthusiasm for what Heidegger called Welterschließung, world disclosure, as unfortunate concessions to romanticism, and as putting me in bad company. But I regard Habermas's insistence that we retain the ideal of universal validity as an unfortunate concession to Platonism. By hanging on to it, it seems to me, Habermas remains enthralled to the philosophical tradition that burdened us with the idea of reason as a human faculty that is somehow attuned to the really real. Going all the way with Habermas's project of replacing a subject-centered conception of reason with a communicative conception would, it seems to me, leave us without any need or use for the notion of universal validity. Sorry. Going all the way with Habermas's project of replacing a subject-centered conception of reason with a communicative conception would, it seems to me, leave us without any need or use for the notion of universal validity. For it would let one think of rational inquiry as having no higher goal than solving the transitory problems of the day. Habermas and I both distrust metaphysics, but whereas he thinks that we must find a metaphysics-free interpretation of the notion of universal validity in order to avoid the seductions of romanticism, I think that notion and metaphysics stand or fall together. One way to express our disagreement is to say that I cast Habermas in the role in which he casts Hegel, as someone who almost reaches the correct philosophical position, but fails to take the last crucial step. One of the central points Habermas makes in the philosophical discourse of modernity is that Hegel almost, but not quite, broke the hold of subject-centered conceptions of rationality. He came very close to replacing it, once and for all, with what Terry Pinkard has called, quote, the doctrine of the sociality of reason, end quote. That doctrine holds that an individual human being cannot be rational all by itself, for the same reasons that she cannot use language all by herself. For unless and until we take part in what Robert Brandom calls, quote, the game of giving and asking for reasons, end quote, we remain unthinking brutes. Habermas thinks that if Hegel had managed to carry through on this proto-Wittgensteinian line of thought, we might have been spared the aggressive post-Hegelian anti-rationalisms of Kierkegaard, Bergson, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, Foucault, and others. But for Hegel to have taken the plunge, he would have had to drop the idea of absolute knowledge. He would have had to turn his back on Parmenides, Plato, and the quest for the kind of grandeur that becomes possible only when doubt is eliminated, when no participant in the conversation has anything left to say, and so history, and perhaps time as well, can come to an end. To do that, Hegel would have had to give up the confluence of the divine and the human at which his system aimed. He would have had to rest content with the idea that the conversation of humankind would go its unpredictable way for as long as our species lasts, solving particular problems as they happen to arise, and by working through the consequences of those solutions, generating new problems. One way to follow up on Habermas's criticism of Hegel is to say that Hegel took on the impossible task of reconciling the romantic idea that the human future might become unimaginably different, unimaginably richer than the human past, with the Greek idea that time, history, and diversity are distractions from an eternal oneness. As with Goethe, much of Hegel's greatness lies in his having heightened the tensions between the temporal and the eternal, and between the classic and the romantic, rather than in his success in synthesizing them. It is as if the cunning of reason used Hegel to intensify this tension, thereby warning us against attempting any such synthesis. John Dewey, the greatest of the left Hegelians, heeded this warning. Dewey had no use either for theodicy or for the ideal of absolute knowledge. He was interested only in helping people solve problems, and had no wish for either grandeur or profundity. His abandonment of both goals has resulted in his being dismissed as a bourgeois bore, which was pretty much the way Russell regarded him. Both Russell and Heidegger thought Dewey incapable of rising to the spiritual level on which philosophy should be conducted. One reason that Dewey is my philosophical hero is that I think it would be a good idea for philosophers to bourgeoisify themselves, to stop trying to rise to the spiritual level at which Plato and Nietzsche confront each other. Indeed, it would be best if they would stop thinking in terms of levels altogether, cease to imagine themselves as ascending to heights or plumbing depths. In order to develop this point, I turn now from the universalist metaphor of ascent to an overarching framework that transcends the merely human to the romantic metaphor. I turn now from the universalist metaphor of ascent to an overarching framework that transcends the merely human to the romantic metaphor of descent to the very bottom of the human soul. One of Dewey's most trenchant critics, Arthur Lovejoy, was also a distinguished historian of ideas. In the latter capacity, he urged that it was time to put aside the hackneyed opposition between classicism and romanticism, to treat it as an overused, worn-out historiographical device. In a celebrated essay, Lovejoy listed a large number of intellectual movements that had been labeled romanticism, and showed not only that nothing bound them together, but that some of them stood in direct opposition to one another. Isaiah Berlin is one of the few historians of ideas who have had the courage to challenge Lovejoy on his own ground, and to insist that he was, in this instance, mistaken. Quote, "There was a romantic movement," Berlin insists. "It did," he continues, "have something that was central to it. It did create a great revolution in consciousness, and it is important to discover what this is." End quote. Berlin revivifies the notion of romanticism by opposing it not to classicism, but to universalism. He thereby transforms it into one term of a philosophical rather than a literary contrast. He calls universalism, quote, "the backbone of the main Western tradition," end quote, and says that it was that backbone that Romanticism cracked. Romanticism, Berlin says, was the deepest and most long-lasting of all changes in the life of the West, end quote. Prior to the late 18th century, Berlin claims, Western thinkers were pretty much agreed on three doctrines. First, all genuine questions can be answered. Second, all these answers can be discovered by public means which, as Berlin says, can be learned and taught to other persons. Third, all these answers are compatible with one another. They all fit together into one truth. As Berlin nicely put it, Western thinkers viewed human life as the attempt to solve a jigsaw puzzle. He describes what I have called their obsession with universalistic grandeur as follows, quote, "There must be some way of putting the pieces together. The all-wise being, the omniscient being, whether God or an omniscient earthly creature, whichever way you like to conceive of it, is in principle capable of fitting all the pieces together into one coherent pattern. Anyone who does this will know what the world is like, what things are, what they have been, what they will be, what the laws are that govern them, what man is, what the relation of man is to things, and therefore what man needs, what he desires, and how to obtain it." End quote. Berlin's own philosophical writings are built around his conviction that the pieces will not, in fact, fit together. The theme of his best-known essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, is that some goods are incompatible with one another. No matter what socio-political setup we come to agree on, something will be lost. Somebody will get hurt. This is a view with which Dewey would have entirely agreed. As Berlin tells the story, the French Revolution forced us to face up to an incompatibility. The unity of truth cannot be reconciled with the fact that, quote, Danton, a sincere revolutionary who committed certain errors, did not deserve to die, and yet Robespierre was perfectly right to put him to death, end quote. The romantic reaction to this paradox, Berlin says, The romantic reaction to this paradox, Berlin says, was to attach the highest importance to such values as integrity, sincerity, readiness to sacrifice one's life to some inner light, dedication to some ideal for which it is worth both living and dying, end quote. Seen from a Platonist point of view, this amounted to giving passion supremacy over rationality, authenticity over conversibility. Berlin sums up the romantic reaction against the assumption that there is always one right answer to the question, what is to be done, by saying that what Hegel called the collision of good with good is, quote, due not to error, but to some kind of conflict of an avoidable kind, of loose elements wandering about the earth, of values which cannot be reconciled. What matters is that people should dedicate themselves to those values with all that is in them, end quote. Pragmatism differs from Romanticism in taking seriously the collision of good with good while remaining dubious about the total dedication and passionate commitment. Pragmatists think that Danton and Robespierre, and for that matter, Antigone and Creon, should have tried harder to make some sort of deal. The Platonist tradition insists that collisions of good with good are always illusory, because there is always one right thing to do. Pieces of the puzzle that obstinately refuse to fit are to be discarded as mere appearance. But for pragmatists, intellectual and moral conflict is typically a matter of beliefs that have been acquired in the attempts to serve one good purpose, getting in the way of beliefs that were developed in the course of serving another good purpose. The thing to do, they say, is not to figure out what is real and what is merely apparent, but to find some compromise that will let both sides achieve at least some of the good they originally hoped for. This usually means redescribing the situation that gave rise to the various problems, finding a way of thinking about it that both sides might be able to live with. Since pragmatists agree with William James that the true is the good in the way of belief, and since they take the conflict of good with good as inevitable, they do not think that universalist grandeur and finality will ever be attained. Ingenious compromises between old goods will produce new sets of aspirations and new projects, and new collisions between those aspirations and projects forever. We shall never escape what Hegel called, quote, the struggle and labor of the negative, end quote, but that is merely to say that we shall remain finite creatures, the children of specific times and specific places. Plato's idea that the good is the name of a something perfectly unified, something like the Parmenidean one, helped him see all the goods he cherished as compatible with one another. The author of both love poems and mathematical proofs, he wanted to see both as serving a single purpose. If we put the Phaedrus together with the Republic, we can see Plato as trying to fit his attraction to the young men whom he dedicated his poems, his love for Socrates, and his hope for a just city, together with his passion for demonstrative certainty. By, as Nietzsche put it, insisting that only the rational can be beautiful, and by identifying true beauty with ultimate reality, he succeeded in convincing himself that the ugly collision of good with good could be set aside as mere appearance. On Berlin's account, the imperturbable grandeur of the new and radiant world that Plato claimed to have discerned dominated the imagination of the West up until the Romantic movement. Thanks to the thinkers of philosophy's heroic age, such as Spinoza and Kant, the ideal of universalist grandeur was able to survive the secularization of high culture. For these philosophers suggested ways of retaining the jigsaw puzzle view of inquiry, even after we had become Democriteans in our understanding of how things work. They suggested ways in which truth might remain one, how it might still be regarded both as an appropriate object of erotic striving and as an invulnerable ally. The Romantic movement did its best to break apart what Plato thought he had fitted together. It mocked Plato's attempt to fuse mathematical certainty and erotic ecstasy. It refused to think that the particular person or city or book one loves with all one's heart and soul and mind is simply a temporary disguise adopted by something eternal and infinite, something not itself subject to contingency or defeat. It abandoned the idea of an all-encompassing framework which would eventually reveal itself to all who tried hard to think objectively. To quote Berlin again, quote, "What Romanticism did was to undermine the notion that in matters of value, politics, morals, aesthetics, there are such things as objective criteria which operate between human beings, such that anyone who does not use these criteria is simply either a liar or a madman, which is true of mathematics and physics." Romanticism, in other words, undermined the assumption common to Plato, Kant, and Habermas, that there is such a thing as the better argument, better not by reference to its ability to convince some particular audience, but because it possesses universal validity. The idea that there is one right thing to do or to believe, no matter who you are, and the idea that that arguments have intrinsic goodness or badness, no matter who is asked to evaluate them, go hand in hand. Pragmatists discard both ideas. My basic disagreement with Habermas concerns his attempt to retain the notion of intrinsically better argument while adopting a theory of the sociality of reason. These two seem to me, and I think they did to Dewey, like oil and water. If we agree with Berlin that the Romantics exploded the jigsaw puzzle view of inquiry, then we become willing to admit that inquiry need have no higher goal than the solving of problems when they arise. But Berlin, like Dewey, recognized that the Platonist hope of speaking with an authority that is not merely that of a certain time and place had survived within the bosom of Romanticism and engendered what Habermas calls others to reason. Berlin's treatment of the Universalism-Romanticism contrast helps us see that one of the most important ideas the Romantics took over from the onto-theological tradition was that of the infinite. Infinite is an ambiguous term that Universalists and Romantics use in different ways. Universalism's idea of the infinite is of something that encompasses everything else, and thus something against which nothing else has any power. To say that God is infinite is to say that nothing outside him can affect him, much less deter him from his purposes. Romanticism's idea of infinity is different. It is the essentially reactive idea of removing all constraints, and in particular all the limitations imposed by the human past, all those which are built into the ways we currently talk and think. The Romantic idea of infinity has more to do with the figure of Prometheus than that of Socrates. It is the idea of perfect freedom decoupled from that of perfect knowledge and of affiliation with the invulnerable. Berlin uses the terms depth and profundity to describe the Romantic version of the infinite. Here is a passage in which he expatiates on the sense that the Romantics gave these terms. Quote, "When I say that Pascal is more profound than Descartes, or that Kafka is more profound a writer than Hemingway, what exactly am I trying unsuccessfully to convey by means of this metaphor?" According to the Romantics, and this is one of their principal contributions to understanding in general, what I mean by depth, although they do not discuss it under that name, is inexhaustibility, unembraceability. In the case of a work that is profound, the more I say, the more remains to be said. There is no doubt that, although I attempt to describe what their profundity consists in, as soon as I speak, it becomes quite clear that no matter how long I speak, new chasms open. No matter what I say, I always have to leave 3 dots at the end. End quote. Plato thought that conceptualization and argument would eventually bring one to a full stop, to a point beyond which no new chasms opened. His hope that argument will eventually bring us to a point where it will be unnecessary to leave 3 dots at the end epitomizes the jigsaw puzzle view of the human situation, the view that there is a grand overall meaning to human life in general, rather than merely small transitory meanings that are constructed by individuals and communities and abandoned by their successors. The Romantics became convinced that conceptualization and argumentation would always leave 3 dots at the end, and then concluded that it is the poet, or more generally, the imaginative genius, who will save us from finitude, rather than the Socratic dialectician. Berlin says that Friedrich Schiller introduced, quote, for the first time in human thought, end quote, the notion that, quote, ideals are not to be discerned at all, ideals are not to be discovered at all, but to be invented, not to be found, but to be generated as art is generated, end quote. Simultaneously, Shelley was telling Europe that the poet glimpses the gigantic shadows that futurity casts upon the present. For both, the poet does not fit past events together in order to provide lessons for the future, but rather shocks us into turning our backs on the past and incites the hope that our future will be wonderfully different. So much for Berlin's account of the Romantic revolt against universalism. When this revolt was modulated into a philosophical key, the result was a series of attempts to unveil an other to reason. Philosophers made such attempts because they thought of depth as providing a kind of legitimacy that would substitute for the legitimacy that resides in universal agreement. Agreement is, for many of the Romantics, as more recently for Foucault, simply a way of procuring conformity to... Agreement is, for many of the Romantics, as more recently for Foucault, simply a way of procuring conformity to current beliefs and intuitions. Depth does not produce agreement, but for Romantics, it trumps agreement. In the dialectic that runs through the last 2 centuries of philosophical thought, and that Habermas summarizes in his philosophical discourse, the universalists decry each new other to reason as endangering both rationality and human solidarity. The Romantics rejoin that what has been called rationality are merely disguised attempts to eternalize custom and tradition. The Universalists rightly say that to abandon the quest for intersubjective agreement is to abandon the restraints on power which have made it possible to achieve some measure of social justice. The Romantics say, with equal plausibility, that to accept the idea that only what everybody can agree on can be regarded as true is to surrender to the tyranny of the past or over the future. Formulating the opposition in these terms brings me to my central thesis, that pragmatism and its defense of Protagorean anthropocentrism should be viewed as an alternative both to rationalism and to the idea that we can have recourse to an other to reason. The pragmatist response to the dialectic Habermas summarizes in the philosophical discourse of modernity is to say that talk of universal validity is simply a way of dramatizing the need for intersubjective agreement, while romantic ardor and romantic depth are simply ways of dramatizing the need for novelty, the need to be imaginative. Neither need should be elevated over or allowed to exclude the other. So instead of asking epistemological questions about sources of knowledge or metaphysical questions about what there is to be known, philosophers might be content to do what Dewey tried to do, help their fellow citizens balance the need for consensus and the need for novelty. Suggesting how to achieve such balance is not, of course, something that philosophy professors are better at than members of other academic disciplines. To suggest ways of achieving such balance is the work of anyone with ambitions to reshape the surrounding culture. That is why carrying through on F.C.S. Schiller's humanism, his attempt to rehabilitate Protagoras' claim that man is the measure of all things, would mean giving up the idea that there is a special sort of activity called philosophizing. Oh, I got an AI summary, that's funny. Would mean giving up the idea that there's a special sort of activity called philosophizing that has a distinctive cultural role. On the view of culture I am suggesting, intellectual and moral progress is achieved by making claims that seem absurd to one generation into the common sense of the later generations. The role of the intellectual is to effect this change by explaining how the new ideas might, if tried out, solve or dissolve problems created by the old ones. Neither the notion of universal validity nor that of a privileged access to truth are necessary to accomplish this latter purpose. We can work toward intersubjective agreement without being lured by the promise of universal validity. We can introduce and recommend new and startling ideas without attributing them to a privileged source. What both Platonist universalists and other to reason romantics find most exasperating in pragmatism is its suggestion that we shall never be either purified or transfigured by drawing upon such a source, and will never do more than tinker with ourselves. If one thinks that experimentalist tinkering is all we shall ever manage, then one will be suspicious of both universalist metaphors of grandeur and romantic metaphors of depth. For both suggest that a suggestion for further tinkering can gain strength by being tied in with something that is not, in Russell's words, merely of here and now, something like the intrinsic nature of reality or the uttermost depths of the human soul. By contrast, Berlin's view that the best we can do in politics is to iron out as many conflicts as possible exhibits the same pragmatist attitude as Kuhn's view that the best we can do in science is to resolve anomalies as they arise. But for thinkers like Russell and Nagel, universal agreement on the desirability of a political institution or the truth of a scientific theory is not, as it is for pragmatists, just a happy social circumstance, but also a sign that we are getting closer to the true nature of man or of nature. Romantics who relish metaphors of depth are better able than universalists to resist the lures of the jigsaw puzzle view of reality and of the correspondence view of truth, but they often do make the mistake of which Habermas accuses them. They neglect their responsibility for making imaginative suggestions plausible by explaining how the new institution or the new theory might solve problems that the old institutions or theories could not handle. The romantic often tells us that what is needed is authenticity rather than argument, as if the fact that she has had a new idea were enough to exempt her from the responsibility of explaining the utility of that idea. Thus, when Christ is described as the way, the truth, and the life, or when Heidegger tells us that Hitler is the present and future reality of Germany, the claim is that our old ideas, our old problems, and our old projects should simply be shelved in order that our minds might be completely taken over by the new. Instead of being awed by superhuman grandeur, we are to be awed by Promethean daring. Instead of being told that we have been elevated to the level of unchanging truth, we are told that we have finally been put in touch with our deepest self. If we abandon metaphors of height, we shall see neither the ability to attain universal agreement on some updated version of Newton's Principia, nor the need for universal respect and the provisions of the Helsinki Declaration of Human Rights as an indication that these documents somehow correspond to reality. Both the prospect of a fully unified system of scientific explanation and that of a world civilization in which human rights are respected and are inspiring. Both those prospects are inspiring. But inspirational value is obviously not a reliable indicator of validity. Both the appeal to something overarching and invulnerable and the appeal to something ineffable and exhaustively deep are advertising slogans, public relations gimmicks, ways of gaining our attention. We're in the home stretch. If we could come to see such appeals as gimmicks, we might be able to dispense with words like intrinsic, authentic, unconditional, legitimate, basic, and objective. We could get along with such banal expressions of praise or blame as fits the data, sounds plausible, would do more harm than good, offends our instincts, might be worth a try, and is too ridiculous to be taken seriously. Pragmatists who find this sort of banality sufficient think that no inspired poet or prophet should argue for the utility of his ideas from their putative source in some other to reason. Nor should any defender of the status quo argue from the fact of intersubjective agreement, the universality and necessity of the belief about which consensus has been reached. But one can still value intersubjective agreement after one has given up both the jigsaw puzzle view of things and the idea that we possess a faculty called reason that is somehow attuned to the intrinsic nature of reality. One can still value novelty and imaginative power even after one has given up the romantic idea that the imagination is so attuned. I shall conclude by returning to the contrast between the days when philosophy was central to intellectual life and our own time. The main reason for philosophy's marginalization, as I said earlier, is the same as the reason why warfare between science and theology looks quaint: the fact that nowadays we are all commonsensically materialist and utilitarian. But there is a further reason. This is that quarrels which, in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, gradually replaced the warfare between the gods and the giants, the quarrels between philosophy and poetry and between philosophy and sophistry, have themselves become tedious. The intellectuals of recent times have grown weary of watching philosophical fashion swing back and forth between enthusiasts for enduring grandeur, such as Russell and Nagel, and celebrants of ineffable profundity like Bergson and Heidegger. It has become harder to persuade them that the fate of civilization depends either on avoiding the excesses of scientific rationalism or on guarding against the frivolous irrationalism of the literatures. The arguments about relativism between pragmatists like myself and those who denounce us as deniers of truth excite only very languid interest. The idea that the philosophical foundations of our culture need attention or repair now sounds silly, since it is a long time since anybody thought that it had a foundation, philosophical or otherwise. Only the philosophy professors still take seriously the Cartesian idea of a natural order of reasons, an ahistorical and transcendental inferential structure that dictates the priority of the questions philosophers ask to the questions other intellectuals ask. Perhaps the best way to describe the diminishing interest in philosophy among the intellectuals is to say that the infinite is losing its charm. We are becoming commonsensical finitists, people who believe that when we die, we rot, that each generation will solve old problems only by creating new ones, that our descendants will look back on much that we have done with incredulous contempt, and that progress toward greater justice and freedom is neither inevitable nor impossible. We are becoming content to see ourselves as a species of animal that makes itself up as it goes along. The secularization of high culture that thinkers like Spinoza and Kant helped bring about has put us in the habit of thinking horizontally rather than vertically, figuring out how we might arrange for a slightly better future, rather than looking up to an outermost framework or down into the ineffable depths. Philosophers who think all this is just as it should be can take a certain rueful satisfaction in their own steadily increasing irrelevance. That's it. For those who are still here, this was an essay called Grandeur, Profundity, and Finitude by Richard Rorty from his collection Philosophy as Cultural Politics. And that's it for me. It's 12:40 night. Yes, and yes, it was very dense, and I am single. I guess I can stick around if anybody wants to chat about it, but I don't know why anyone would. But, I'll give it a minute if anyone wants to say anything. My messages after, okay. It's kind of a downer of an essay because he's basically, I mean, Rorty was a philosophy professor, so he's basically saying why he thinks his own discipline has become irrelevant. And I mean, he makes a lot of good points. It's true that during the Enlightenment, the philosophers were like very important. I mean, their books were bestsellers. People talked about ideas, philosophical ideas, debates about metaphysics and stuff, and that doesn't happen anymore. And there are reasons why it doesn't happen, because a lot of the core tensions between religion and science, or between romanticism and classicalism and whatever, those were resolved in one way or another. And so basically we have some fixed, steady set of life options available in Western culture, and people are fine with that, or most people just don't think about it at all. So, yeah, it's funny because this essay seems like such a downer, but what he takes this idea and does with it is much less depressing. He basically says that, well, see, if the philosopher's role is to, what he loves this quote from Hegel, hold his own time in thought and try to understand the core intellectual tensions that drive his own era and try to clarify things, then the real business of a philosopher is to try and tap into the cultural politics and the currents of intellectual life that are causing the most difficulty for people, and try to talk the way around those. And yeah, so it's kind of a nice thing. I also just appreciate how like thoroughgoingly and unantagonistically secularist he is. I mean, he has really hilarious things to say about religion, without being flashy or mean about it the way a new atheist is. Like, he fully respects that a lot of people value legitimate or derive legitimate value from religion, but he doesn't. He still thinks it would be better if we didn't have a lot of people trying to foist their beliefs into the public square. Yeah. So, I mean, I think the problem, I don't want to say too much about new atheists, but I think one of the problems with the new atheists is the sort of consistent theme that you get in kind of post-Christian intellectual groups, which is there's still that strong impulse toward Platonist universalism and toward the sort of dogmatic rationalism that Christianity itself represented. And so what you get in figures like Dawkins, say, is a dogmatism of a different sort that is incurious and inflexible and not interested in the subtlety that's necessary to do justice to the ideas that he's attacking. And it's not to say that I think that Dawkins is super wrong about the problems that he sees in religion. There are a lot. It does actually hurt people in many cases, but it's not, let's say, the most practical approach. And I think that in the long run, those guys have done probably as much harm as they've done help, because of the approach that they took. If you have more of a pragmatic approach, am I from New York? I live in New York. I'm not from here originally. I'm from the Midwest. If you take more of a pragmatic approach to this stuff, to like talking about why religion is bad, well, you can accept that sometimes people you can accept that sometimes people get something good out of it, right? Like, some people do not get harmed by it, do not harm others because of their belief in religious views, and that's fine, and that's good, and we should acknowledge that. Anyway, yeah, cool, okay. Hey, and I'm gonna go because it's super late. Good night, all.